Well, hello there, Little Masters, and welcome back to the Prancing Pony Podcast, where today, here in the Common Room, we're closing out Season 3 with not one, but two legendary scholars in the field of Tolkien studies.
And we truly cannot wait to introduce them to you. But first, I'm Sean Marchese, the real-life Lord of the Mark, and I'm here with the man of the West, who may be a legend, but isn't quite a legendary scholar, Alan Sisto.
That's still far too generous, Sean, but I accept. Folks, today we are welcoming Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull to the podcast. Now, I don't think there's one of you listening who doesn't have a book on your shelf that's either written by, edited by, or at least has a contribution from these two scholars. They're librarians, researchers, and writers, and they also happen to be husband and wife.
And between them, they've written or edited at least a dozen books on Tolkien and many more articles, working in collaboration with each other for almost 25 years. Their works include some of our favorites, such as The Lord of the Rings, A Reader's Companion, the J.R.R. Tolkien Companion and Guide, and a number of books showcasing Tolkien's art, such as J.R.R. Tolkien, Artist and Illustrator, The Art of the Hobbit, and The Art of the Lord of the Rings.
And of course, they've also edited a number of Tolkien's works for publication, including Roverandom, Farmer Giles of Ham, and The Adventures of Tom Bombadil. And Wayne has brought you the most complete bibliography on the publications of J.R.R. Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, A Descriptive Bibliography.
Their work has received numerous well-deserved accolades and awards, including 9 scholarship awards from the Mythopoeic Society between the two of them.
Good heavens.
And the 2018 Tolkien Society Award for Best Website for their blog Too Many Books and Never Enough.
Never enough indeed. Well, that was a long introduction, granted, but they are very accomplished guests. We are truly honored and very excited to have them on the show today and bring them to you. So, Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull, let me be the first to say, welcome to the Prancing Pony Podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having us.
And thank you.
It is really our pleasure. Sean, I think you've got the first question up. Why don't we go ahead and start?
I do, and again, I just want to say thank you both for joining us. It really is an honor to have you here. But we'll go ahead and jump into questions, and we always like to start with a little getting to know you question for all of our guests. So I'd like to ask both of you, and you can take turns answering this or answer this together, however you prefer. But I'd like to ask, when and how did you each first discover Tolkien's work? And then, when and how did you make the first step towards becoming scholars and researchers, as opposed to just enjoying his work as fans, like so many of us?
Well, we're looking at each other right now. Who is going to start? Actually, Christina, you read Tolkien before I did, so you may go first.
Well, I began in 1955 when The Two Towers was out and before The Return of the King came out. It was recommended to me by a librarian. My parents let me use the adult library. I had their tickets and I used to get books from there. And a young librarian came up to me and she said, "I think you'll like this." But she showed me The Two Towers. And of course, it was the second volume. And I looked at it and I thought, well, yeah, I will, but I'll wait till I can read the first one. Now, I know I can date it correctly for several things. I can, or rather, I could in the past remember, and now I remember remembering. I asked my mother, what happens if he dies before he finishes it?
Oh.
Well, he didn't.
Right. Thankfully.
But strangely enough, I can't remember reading The Return of the King the first time. But I do know that I kept on reading it, and then there came a time in the autumn of 1956 when I was reading again and I couldn't renew The Return of the King. I was horrified at the library and I had just enough pocket money to allow me to go and buy my own copy, which I still have. And wow. I spent the next 2 months pocket money plus the extra money my father gave me if I got a good class list every month at school and bought the next 2 volumes. So I have my own set.
And this was before the days of the paperback.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes, they're hardcover. So that was me. I've been gradually bought the things as they came out, got to know them and enjoyed it. But it wasn't until Brian Sibley's BBC broadcasting that I listened to that and I thought, I've got to go back. And I looked at all the books that were out. I wanted to collect every different variant cover. I wanted to collect every piece of information I could and started putting together what I thought would be a complete library of Tolkien and a complete library of everything written about him.
This is the slippery slope of the collector, you understand.
Far too familiar.
This is where it starts.
I can already hear sort of the seeds, yeah.
I mean, it were things like I put together scrapbooks of cuttings. I was interested in reviews. Charles Node, who was the bibliographer
Mm-hmm.
of the Tolkien Society, and I got permission from Rainer Unwin, and we went up to where they had a lot of their records were kept, and we were allowed to photocopy all the press reviews and press cuttings about Tolkien that Allen and Unwin had.
Wow.
Long ago lost in one of the takeovers.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have my set put into scrapbooks.
Yeah, so when you see Tom Shippey in one of the Landseer films about Tolkien at around the time of the Tolkien centenary, when he's looking at a scrapbook and reading, that's one of Christina's scrapbooks.
Oh, my goodness.
Okay, wow.
But, publishers sometimes being businesses, they dumped the originals.
Oh.
So there you were at the 81 BBC Lord of the Rings on the radio, and you're buying new things, and then...
Well, I continued buying.
You joined the Tolkien Society.
I joined the Tolkien Society, and because I wanted everything, I also joined Beyond Bree. And when I first wrote to Nancy Marsh, I mentioned in my first letter that the Book of Lost Tales Part 1, I think, had just come. They came out earlier in England than America. There was about 3 or 4 months gap for the first ones. That was out. And she said, well, please write a review. And I did write a review for each of the volumes as it came out, and that was very important. But I think Wayne can bring us up to a bit more up to date on that now, on your side of it.
Okay.
Oh, on my side.
So that would have started, I think, Christina, the mid-1980s then, I think we're up to at this
early
point,
80s,
right?
Yeah, mid-early 1980s.
Right, after the 81 BBC radio.
Right.
Yeah.
For me, I started in, I think, 1970. I was, I think, a junior in high school, and... back in those days, nearly every place that you would go, nearly every shop had a rack of paperbacks. And I remember I was in what we would now call a home improvement store, but back in the day we called it a lumber yard.
Right.
And they had a rack of paperbacks, and they had the Ballantine Lord of the Rings.
Better than the Ace paperbacks,
But,
right?
yes. I think they'd been supplanted by then, that they'd run out of copies. And I saw they had the Two Towers and the Return of the King, and I thought these are very intriguing covers. And I also remembered seeing the title, The Lord of the Rings, written on the chalkboard at school, because somebody apparently had done a book review in an earlier session in the same room. So on a whim, I bought those, and I think those were something like 65 cents at the time.
Wow.
Takes you back.
Yeah, yeah.
And then I had to go out looking for volume 1.
Of course.
I found the Fellowship of the Ring in a grocery store, and I bought that. But before I found that, I was at a drugstore, and I found the enchanting prelude to The Lord of the Rings. I thought, I didn't know about The Hobbit. So I thought I'd better have this first. And that same place had Lynn Carter's A Look Behind the Lord of the Rings.
Oh, wow. Okay.
One of the earliest books of criticism, which is not thought much of, but it was a fascinating thing at the time because there really wasn't much else.
Right.
So I took those home and I read those. I liked The Hobbit well enough, but The Lord of the Rings was something very different. And I began to read that every year, much to the amusement of some of my classmates in school, because I kept reading it into college. And then I started to buy books because of Tolkien.
Yeah.
Partly because of Lynn Carter, because Carter had talked about Tolkien sources or analogs. It was enough that I started to buy books and fill up what was then maybe 2 shelves, which is a tiny fraction, of course.
Oh, yes, of course.
Right, of course, yeah.
I have a photograph of my shelves back then, and I thought that was a lot of books at the time. So I started to buy books, and I started to become interested in the arrangement of books, so that after I got over wanting to be an English teacher, partly because I didn't like the level of politics that I saw going into college teaching, I decided to go to library school, as we used to call it, and became a librarian. And while I was in library school, for my amusement, and this tells you what librarians do for amusement, I spent time in the library, and I discovered a brief bibliography that someone had done. It was a bibliography of Tolkien's writings and of writings about Tolkien, which there were far fewer then than there are now.
Right,
and this we're now talking 1975.
Okay.
So I decided that because this was dated by a few years, that I would write a supplement.
Oh.
And that was the first bibliographical work I did. And lo and behold, it actually was published in 1976, I think, just
My
about
goodness. Wow.
when I went to Williams College as assistant in the Chapin Library of Rare Books.
Okay.
And it was that experience that led me to think, well, there has never been a what we would call a descriptive bibliography of Tolkien's writings, whereby, if you know the work, every one of Tolkien's writings, at least of the books, is described physically,
Right.
as well as with an account of their publication history, which had not been done except as of 1977, insofar as Humphrey Carpenter included some details in his biography. So I started to work on that, privately as a hobby. And then a few years later, I was actually contacted, or I think the Tolkien Society was contacted first by a man who was running St. Paul's Bibliographies in Winchester, England, who had wanted a bibliography of Tolkien. So they got in touch with me. The Tolkien Society got in touch with me. But Douglas Anderson was also working privately on a Tolkien bibliography. So we decided to join forces. Doug had worked largely on the periodical literature. He'd done a lot of work beyond what Carpenter had done. And I was working mainly on the books because I had the professional training in descriptive bibliography.
With library science, right?
Yes. Eventually, Doug went on to other work, especially the annotated Hobbit, which was, of course, a major and important project. And I went on and completed the bibliography, which came out in 1993. I've done some addenda and corrigenda since then. Of course, the question everyone asks me is, when is the second edition going to come out? Because it's been a while.
It has,
since 1993.
Right.
And a lot of Tolkien has been published.
That's true.
And the answer I always give is, well, someday. But HarperCollins has kept us busy with other Tolkien projects. Yeah. And those are things that you don't want to say no to.
No, you're right.
So that was how I got reading Tolkien. And Christina had her experience.
Right.
And then those two sort of came together at the time of the Tolkien Centenary Conference.
Well, we met before that
at
a Tolkien Society meeting. I mean, you were told you should come and see my collection because even at that point it was growing fast. So that came up. But at just about the same time, the Tolkien Society and also certainly said the Mythopoeic Society were thinking of the centenary of Tolkien's birth coming up.
Right.
They finally decided to have one conference, but with the Tolkien Society doing most of the organizing.
Right.
Because it was in England.
Yes. And I was on the committee for a year or two. And then the person who was chair of the committee wanted to go into politics. I don't know whether he ever succeeded, but anyway, he was an elected member of the Tolkien Society. And the society, if you have a subcommittee, there must be at least one member on it, and preferably the person in charge who is an elected member of the society. Right. And it was suggested that I should become one of the elected members. So I became chair of the committee for the Centenary Conference. Well, that, of course, I had already, and through that, I was dealing with the guests and writing to them, the people we were we were paying to have there. I also got to know Joy Hill, who had done secretarial work.
Yeah.
She actually lived 10 minutes walk from me, and Donald Swan lived 5 minutes walk from me.
Oh, my goodness.
I always got to know Joy very well. And she also entertained Wayne and let him see all her books to help with the bibliography. I also had got to know Raina a little bit. And, of course, Joy knew Raina very well.
Well, yeah.
And at this point, Wayne had was asking permission for his bibliography to be published because he wanted lots of quotes.
Sure.
Yes. Well, and I got Rainer to write a brief foreword for the bibliography. And Rainer also gave me permission, both of us permission, to look at the Allen and Unwin records, some of which ended up at the University of Reading. We spent some time in their basement going through the publishers' records.
Oh, okay.
And also correspondence that we looked at actually in their offices as they were being dismantled because they'd been Unwin Hyman at the time, and HarperCollins had bought Unwin Hyman.
Right.
Okay.
So the bibliography was underway. It was going to be published, we knew, at the time of the Centenary Conference, and people were looking forward to that.
Yeah.
And as chairman for the Tolkien Society, I sat next to Christopher at the conference banquet.
Oh.
I'd also been in contact with him before because I had dealt with any correspondence with the guests I dealt with as the chair.
Right.
Okay.
And just before the conference started, or on the same day rather, the earlier Bodleian exhibition done by Judith Priestman opened.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd had a quick look of it on the evening before the main conference started.
Right.
And of course I had to make polite conversation
Sure.
with Christopher.
Of course.
He also knew that I had, in fact, a degree in history of art because he knew that I worked at the museum in London,
Mm-hmm.
and he had the contacts in case he needed me. And in fact, he did need me on one occasion because the French post had sent the signed labels which he'd supplied for the members of the conference. They'd sent it back to him at his home address.
Oh.
But anyway, I said to him, I made a couple of comments to him. People were always criticizing the history of Middle-earth. Why do they want to dig into all this? Or at least some people were.
Yeah.
And I was saying, where I work, which was a museum, Sir John Soane Museum, which has the drawings of one of England's major architects, people will do a whole PhD on one building.
Right.
Why
Right.
can't you do that on a book?
Yeah.
Right.
And I made that comment. And then I also said I'd seen the exhibition quickly, and I just wished that they would have a book on the art.
Yes.
And he said, yes, I want that too. But he said, there's a problem. So the person who writes it has to know about art, but they also have to know about my father's writings and understand their relationship to the art.
Absolutely.
And then he stopped for a minute. Now, he knew about Wayne. He'd seen samples of Wayne's bibliography, and he had seen all my reviews in Beyond Ree of the history of Middle-earth, because he'd said to me that he'd read them. And he stopped for a minute, and he said to me, would you and Wayne be interested in writing such a book?
Wow.
I'm getting chills on behalf of you. in putting myself in that place, thinking what that must have been like. Oh,
I
goodness.
sort of gulped.
Yeah.
And it was far on into the banquet and tried not to slip under the table in shock.
Right. Sure.
We were engaged by that time.
Okay.
And he knew about that.
Yeah.
So we thought, well, yes.
Yes.
We will,
How quickly can I say yes?
That's a question you say yes to. Absolutely.
Can we get that into contract tonight?
Well, we did have, of course, what we had to do was to submit
Yes.
a sort of synopsis or how we would go about it for his approval.
Oh, of course.
And it took a few months because then they opened up, and the stuff that was closed, all the artwork which was not available for any, was open to us to look at.
Oh, how lovely that must have been.
Have you seen either of the exhibitions?
I've seen the Bodleian exhibition. I was there when I attended Oxenmoot in October.
Well, I reckon that probably about 60 or 70% of the items there we'd actually held in our hands.
Oh,
wow.
I believe it, because many of those
wonderful.
I'd seen in the various art books. I have all three of those, and many of those I'd come to know very well from looking them in your
From the
works.
books. Sure. Yeah.
But also, the other thing was when we were doing the companion and guide, Tolkien reused a lot of sheets of paper. So we were going through everything at Marquette and all the available papers at the Bodley that were not restricted, looking to see if he'd reused letters or invitations or anything else. And it's surprising what one gathered by
Oh, I imagine it would be, yes.
So we had, it took us a few years to do Artist and Illustrator. We were married in December of 1994, and the book came out in 95.
Autumn 95.
Autumn 95, when Christina moved to America, and has done pretty well.
Yeah.
It actually, went from hardback into paperback and then back into hardback, and then they had to reprint. It's still in print now. But it's not been superseded by our other two art books, Art of the Hobbit, Art of the Lord of the Rings, although we were limited as to how many pictures we could have in Artist and Illustrator, because we had a the publisher will figure how many pages at this size and this kind of book can we do, and how much is that going to cost
exactly.
versus how much we can legitimately charge for the book,
Right.
and then people will buy it.
And there was only half in color.
Yeah.
Right.
But they did give us the thing that the color could be on any side, because often if they have color,
Oh, yeah.
They print color only on one side of a sheet.
Right.
And then you have to think, well, what is going to be on this side?
Yeah.
It reduces the cost. They only have to do it on one. The original Adventures of Tom Bombadil book from 1962 is like that.
Okay.
Because Artist and Illustrator was successful, then the question was, well, what next?
Right.
And Rainer Unwin gave us a very good piece of advice. He said to us that, remember, because by this time he had stepped down he was no longer the head of the firm.
Right.
It was HarperCollins. He said, remember that a publisher needs you as much as you need the publisher. So put forward what you would like to do.
Yeah.
And we came up with, I don't know, about 8 or 10, I think, different ideas.
Okay.
But the most immediate thing that came up was Reverendum.
Very good.
Okay.
Because it was a story that had not been published.
Right.
And there was some talk over the years of doing it, but it was felt that it really wasn't long enough to stand by itself. Tolkien had done a few pictures for it, but
Right.
it wasn't very. And publishers like to have something that's substantial or that seems substantial. Yeah. I think publishers had not yet at that time got to the point they are now, where they will put very little text on a page and bulk out the book just in the number of pages, which seems a sad waste of trees.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. But
they decided that, well, if we would write an introduction to Reverendum, that would flesh it out enough. And we said, well, this was done in the 1920s, and it has a certain amount of vocabulary that really needs notes. Now, publishers for a general audience generally do not like notes.
No.
So we said, well, let's design this, and we're not having footnote numbers or anything like this, but just put the notes in the back, and people can ignore them if they want.
Right.
They can ignore the introduction if they want, which many people do anyway. And this is what I call self-scholarship. You get the information in anyway. And they did that. Was that 1998?
Sounds about right.
Yes.
Yes, right.
I think it was January 1998. It was practically beginning of the year.
Yeah.
We did actually have 2 other suggestions. One of them, we said, looking ahead, of course, the annotated Hobbit had come out. There is the possibility of an annotated Lord of the Rings. And the 50th anniversary is getting close, but that's sort of for the future. But we really wanted and still want to do letters.
An expanded edition of letters.
That would be wonderful.
There's a lot more letters out there.
There are.
Right.
But David Braun, who's the person at HarperCollins and still is, he said, no, the estate don't want that. But he showed us HarperCollins had just published Hooper's Companion and Guide to C.S. Lewis. And he said, if you did a copy of something like this, it would allow you to bring much of the information in, perhaps more letters, and that would be good. So our first contract was Reverendum and would be followed by, and we knew that already that we would be doing this companion and guide, but we could work on both at the same time, and we did actually.
So, Wayne, Christina, you both have been working in the field of Tolkien studies for nearly 30 years now, probably a little bit longer based on your answer just now. How do you believe the field has changed in that time?
Oh.
Well, it used to be so much easier keeping up with other people, because if you got one book a year, you were lucky. Maybe only one every 2 years. Now, trying to keep up with the amount of stuff coming in. And of course, it was much easier for us because we had a chance to absorb things like the history of Middle-earth and the few books that came out like Shippey. But for people now, I don't know how they do it and how they dig in.
It's like drinking from a fire hose.
There's
so much information.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not coming out one at a time. Yeah.
You're right. You're not reading one volume in the history of Middle-earth and then waiting a year for the next one.
Yeah.
Now, when I mentioned that, when I started to read Tolkien there was very little beyond Lynn
Yeah.
Carter, which is hardly the best book on Tolkien, but because there was so little Tolkien that had been published.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, when I wrote my bibliography, when I started to write it, I had an erroneous idea about how much Tolkien had actually written.
Mm.
Now, he did not write a great deal that was published in his lifetime,
Mm-hmm.
including his scholarly writings, but there was more than I knew.
Mm-hmm.
And so much that came out in periodical literature. Nor was I aware, doing a descriptive bibliography, of how many variations there were in different editions or printings of his various books. Right. I had to deal with that. But in terms of anything in formal Tolkien studies, it was a much easier time because there was so much less to deal with.
Mm.
I remember Tolkien studies prior to the appearance of the Silmarillion and Carpenter's biography. Those were the real turning points in 1977. Mm-hmm. And then when Christopher Tolkien got going with Unfinished Tales and with the History of Middle-earth, these are all things that now you need to take into account.
Right.
And I think we've written somewhere that you ignore them at your peril.
Absolutely.
If you're a Tolkien scholar. But it is a great deal to take in. And the literature of Tolkien now, literature about Tolkien, is vast.
So that's putting it mildly.
It's very hard. Mm-hmm. It's very hard for a new scholar coming along to know just what are the more important works.
Mm-hmm. Right.
They're not necessarily the most recent works. And books like our companion and guide, we hope it will be sort of a guide to what people should be looking at. But it's also a much more formal business now.
Yeah.
Tolkien has become much more of a subject for university study. Mm-hmm. He's been accepted as a subject for course offerings. He is now a more legitimate subject for doctoral dissertations.
Mm-hmm.
John Ratliff, when he went to get his doctorate at Marquette, had to do it on Lord Dunsany. He wanted to do it on Tolkien and fantasy and was not allowed to at that time. But even though Marquette University has a major collection, and it was formed there by William Reedy, the librarian, because it was part of the materials that you really need at a university that has vast degrees, so that people have material to work on. But it's also, of course, so much more has become available in terms of primary materials from Marquette, from the Bodleian, and things that have come out that one now has to read and absorb, which is not an easy thing to do.
What do you think has driven maybe that growth? You mentioned earlier that the turning point was the Carpenter biography and the release of the Silmarillion in 1977. As that being a turning point, was that really kind of the start of this acceleration, or is it something else? And if so, what would you point to as maybe a cause of that?
I don't think there was so much coming out straight after that. I think it's probably in the mid-90s. I think up until the mid-90s, you could still keep going. Now, I think so many people want to publish something. There's so many, the things that gets me, so many collections of essays. People don't write whole books.
Yeah, you're right.
They write essays, and it's
true.
much easier. I mean, you see them advertising. I'm doing a book. Yeah. I'm asking for submissions for a book on this subject. Yeah. And I find that there tends to be a lot of repetition. Sometimes editors or even reviewers don't notice that sometimes people don't really know as much as they think they do. I also find myself that unless they're very good, reading a book of essays is sometimes like being hit on the head one time after another as everybody's trying to make a point.
You are right.
Making the point.
You're right. It's very, okay, you've made your point, move on, and then somebody else has to make their point, and pretty soon your brain hurts, yeah.
And too frequently when you do stumble upon a really great point, the essay's over all too quickly, and then you're on to something else that's not as well
written. It does sometimes feel too short. That's right.
That is true. It's not just Tolkien studies, though. I mean, it's the nature of this kind of
academia in general, and literary studies.
The scholar has to have some sort of point, and I think the most amusing ones are those that try to compare Tolkien with some author or poet who is totally disconnected.
Yeah.
Tolkien and T.S. Eliot, or well, how do you do this? And it ends up being something about Tolkien, something about the other person, and but they don't necessarily come together. Yeah. There's actually been essays I've read in Tolkien studies where you get to the end and the author admits that, well, there really isn't anything here.
I think I wrote a few papers in college like that.
But it's good to see the attention that's being paid to Tolkien. And of course, as I said, I think Carpenter and Silmarillion started it, but not immediately, as Christina says. The History of Middle-earth, I think, began to give people the idea that this is something that is really substantive.
Yeah.
And then more recently, it's been a matter of things being publisher-driven, that there is a market.
I was going to say where it really took off, I think, was the first Jackson efforts.
Yeah.
Because almost everything that had been published before was republished, either as was or with just a minor emendation, supposedly updating. Right. There was a whole pile of them coming out. Everybody, and it was a matter, I think, of there's money in this.
Yes.
That market was there. The publisher knew the market was there. Yeah.
I mean, there's a market. Perhaps that's a politer way of putting it. And it also, about the same time, you began to get the niche things. Far more people who were doing it just from the religious aspect or from other aspects. So gradually picking up feminism and other things.
Ecology, yes.
And it was at that point, up until then, we had tried to have a complete books on Tolkien complete, as well as books by Tolkien. And it was about 2002, 2003 that we looked at each other with the shelves filling up and said, do we really want to have this particular book?
Yes, especially after print on demand and self-publishing came in. So
the
that
bar,
anybody
the bar of entry is much lower.
Right.
And we know all about that because there's absolutely no bar to entering podcasting. Standards are very low, man. I'm telling you.
and also with blogging and things like that. And
that's true.
Anybody can start a blog. There are some good blogs out there. There's some very good blogs out there. There are
yours included, which we'll get to.
Yes. But it's true that bar of entry now is really
much lower,
close to the floor now. It seems like anybody can step over it and get their thoughts on it.
Try to get something out there.
And I suppose there's good and bad in that.
Yeah, you just have to have a little more discernment as you look through all the various materials. Yeah. But you're right, because now that piles in so much stuff for the reader and the scholar and the fan to look at and to try to determine what's worth my time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where something like your companion guide really come into play, because you reference so many other works that it really helps. I think you mentioned this, Wayne, that you're hoping that serves as a guide, a roadmap for folks as they look to pull together other books, other works to study. So
yeah, and the reader's companion as well, just like the annotated Hobbit. Having, as you're reading the book, having these cross references to other works, other scholarship, other works by Tolkien, unfinished works by Tolkien, is a really nice roadmap for readers.
There is another thing that's come in now, which is a little difficult, that a lot of people want to own Tolkien. Pressing that, he wrote this inspired The Lord of the Rings.
Right.
This inspired that. I think the funniest thing we ever read was by a newspaper report which said some mountains in Scotland must have influenced them because they're just like the Jackson films.
Oh my goodness, that's quite silly indeed.
But, it's a sort of, and strangely enough, even places which have good connections, Birmingham, Stonyhurst, want more than they've got sometimes, not all.
Well, like we've said before, there's a market there.
Right.
And even we've discovered that when we first started the show, and I don't want to get too far sidetracked, but we didn't expect more than about 50 or 100 people who knew us from various Facebook groups to listen. We're just a couple of guys. We don't pretend to be scholars. Maybe knowledgeable amateurs might be as far as we would take ourselves.
Avid readers of the literature and the literature about the literature.
Exactly. And so, when we put that out there, we didn't expect much. And now I think we're going to close in. By the time this episode releases, we'll have had 1 million downloads total in less than 3 seasons. And it's stunning to me that there is such a market out there. And it's that market that I think drives the effort of so many publishers to put just more and more material out there. These books, and I don't want to name names, but there are authors who are, shall we say, not looked upon kindly by those of us in the Tolkien Society, who continually churn out stuff that you find at Costco. And it's mind-numbingly frustrating to see people buy this stuff. And you're like, well, do you have Carpenter's biography? Who's that? I've got this book by...
Yes. Right. We know who you're talking about.
I know you don't. Yes. And so do our listeners, but I don't want my lawyers to get any business, so we're going to not say anything else.
No. Well, it's interesting, though, that the publishers will continue to do these things, and happily for us. Yeah. But, certainly you cannot find all of these things in your local Barnes and Noble. And I have to wonder, how well do these books actually do? There's sort of a glut on the market. Even Tolkien's American publishers don't take everything by Tolkien that's being published now.
We've had to order a few UK editions,
Right, but then that's another big change in what drives things is the fact that you have the internet and you have Amazon. And you can get books from overseas. Whereas Christina and I, when we first met, we were buying each other books. I would buy her American books. She would buy me British books because that was the easiest way to get them. This was pre-internet. But the internet and, of course, your podcasts like yours are part, again, of the changed environment. It used to be that if you liked Tolkien, you would join the Tolkien Society, you join the Mythologic Society, you would get the publications, you might go to one of the conferences. And thereby you met people and were able to have conversations like we're having now. But with the internet, Facebook groups, forums, podcasts, this is all part of the general sort of fan conversation that's going on, and it enables you to do things. And you do them in a different way than we used to.
No, that's quite true. Well, I know we could explore that question alone for the next hour, but we do want to get to some of your work. So we're going to start. We're halfway through the show, but we want to start by talking about one of your reference works that we've mentioned a number of times on the show here in our third season, and that's The Lord of the Rings: A Reader's Companion. Now, folks, for those who don't know, it was originally published in 2005, revised as recently as 2014. I suspect many of our listeners know a lot about it now because we've mentioned it probably just about every episode that we're in the books. It's been a wonderful resource for us, and we love to point people to it. But for those who don't know, it's a set of annotations to The Lord of the Rings, page by page. It's a little bit like Douglas Anderson's annotated Hobbit, but like you say in the preface, it wasn't practical to produce an edition like that with annotations in the margins of the text. You'd need a pickup truck to carry it around. You pulled from a lot of different sources, Tolkien's other works, the history of Middle-earth, his letters, published and unpublished, archives, Tolkien scholarship. So with all that as background, I want to ask you this. What was your ultimate goal with The Reader's Companion? And with that in mind, how did you decide what to include and what to exclude?
Well, as Christina said earlier, we had originally proposed an annotated edition.
Right.
And realized that that was not practical, and also that anybody who would be interested in the annotations already owned at least one edition.
True, quite true.
Maybe more.
So we conceived of this as something that could be used with any edition, although keyed both to the old standard 3-volume edition and to the new 50th anniversary edition, because we were editing that at the same time.
Oh, okay. I was wondering about that.
Preparing that. And of course, we had to do that first.
Yeah. Otherwise, your pagination, you wouldn't have been able to reference all those.
We needed the pagination. But also, because the 50th anniversary was coming up, we had to have it by 2004. So that got priority. And then we were able to attack the Reader's Companion after that, although we were doing some work on that at the same time, because the editing of The Lord of the Rings meant that Christina especially had all sorts of copies of The Lord of the Rings out on the table, and we had gathered together information about errors and corrections and changes that were made between the editions.
Textual variants.
Textual variations. And we also had, we knew about questions that people had over the years that we gathered together. But basically, we both went through the text and looked for things that needed glossing, that had we could relate to drafts that had been published in the history of Middle-earth, that we knew had some sort of correlation with something in real life. And little by little, it builds up.
And we scanned all the timescales at Marquette.
Oh,
Well,
wow.
yes, the synoptic timetables, the synoptic chronologies that Tolkien did, that was fascinating pieces of work that he did. And, that helped a lot.
And the little bits like the Hobbit scales and the
Hobbit
end strides,
measures
yes,
and so
and the
forth,
end
yes.
strides and the rest of it.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
We also had notes that supplied from the Tolkien correspondence, notes that he had written to the Dutch publisher when he disagreed, particularly when he disagreed with things, and one of the unfinished index that Tolkien had, which we had access to.
We had also, of course, gone through Tolkien's correspondence, both published letters and anything else that we had, and those brought up some things. But as you can see, the fact that this has appeared in several editions now, there's no end to it. There's always something more that can be said about The Lord of the Rings, some point that comes up, and people have disagreed with us on some points, and we've had to address those. Oddly enough, the edition that's published in the United States is still the first edition.
Huh.
They have never brought in the revised text.
Interesting.
We revised the text first when HarperCollins wanted to do a trade paperback. We were able to do some changes there, and then a revised hardback came in, which was a lot of fun to do because they had it printed by a printer who was no longer in business, and the printer had the files for that.
Oh.
So we needed to sort of recreate things from what it was.
Re-engineer.
Well, and the fact that we were making some changes on pages, but we didn't want to make too many changes because we didn't want to have to redo the index, the internal cross-references. I actually had to reconstruct, I think it was 100 pages for the new edition.
Oh, my goodness.
Fortunately, I'm also a typographer and book designer, so I can do that. But, it was a little bit more labor intensive than just adding a few things. Because by then we had put Addenda and Corrigenda online, and we still do.
Right.
Which is, of course, one of the great things about the web environment we live in now, that we can do things like that.
Right. Well, I'd like to spend some time talking about one of the other writings by Tolkien that you included in the Reader's Companion, and that's the nomenclature of The Lord of the Rings. One of my favorite resources, and I want to thank you for putting it out there. And our listeners have heard us refer to it a number of times. It's the guide that Tolkien himself prepared to help translators attempting to translate his work. It gives definitions and etymologies for some of the names of people and places in the book. We've referenced it a number of times because we are very big word nerds here at the Prancing Pony Podcast.
That we are.
Now, in the preface, you say that Tolkien had actually started working on a glossary index for The Lord of the Rings, which he never finished. And then this nomenclature document is the closest thing we've got to that. I'd like to get your thoughts on why an etymological glossary of this kind is so important for Tolkien's work, more so than for many other authors that are out there.
We're looking at each other.
I'm just trying to get my mind around it because there was some problem with all this.
Yes, that's why I'm leaving it to you, because you've got it in mind.
Well, you go on talking about it.
All right. Words in Tolkien, of course, words were very important to Tolkien. And one of the answers I always give to the question of why, what makes Tolkien's Lord of the Rings so great? And I say it's because he was a master of the English language, because he knew what words meant.
Right.
And not just in English, but in any of the invented languages. And obviously in other languages as well, because he could make so many comments to the people who wanted to translate his works and say, well, this is right, this is not right. He was not happy with the first translation of The Hobbit, for instance, the Dutch translation, let alone the Swedish Lord of the Rings.
And I think those were the ones that prompted him developing the nomenclature, right?
Yes, especially that. But it's extremely interesting work. It first appeared in Tolkien Compass that J.R.R. Lovedale had edited. But as we got to the Reader's Companion, the Tolkien estate felt that we're going to sort of bring it back into print. This was, I think, before the second edition of the Tolkien Compass came out, that this was the place to do it. Have you found it?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we know that he wrote to Cotton Minchin, and I'm quoting, an index of names was to be produced, which by etymological interpretation would also provide quite a large Elvish vocabulary. This, of course, is the first requirement. I worked on it for months and indexed the first two volumes. Now, that has actually been, we asked Christopher for the unfinished index, and we thought what he sent us was that. Now, I think my explanation on page 726 of the updated Companion and Guide, I'll have to read that out. When we came to write The Lord of the Rings, A Reader's Companion, we asked to see a copy of the Index of Names and Strange Words, but were sent instead the rough index of place names, which are also referred to in the correspondence. And although we recognize that the latter was not etymological and dealt with all 3 volumes rather than only the first 2, nevertheless we confused one index with the other and then compounded the confusion by calling the index of place names the unfinished index, as if it were the one Tolkien referred to in his letter to Cotton Minchin. Not until the publication of words, phrases, and passages in various tongues in The Lord of the Rings in Palmer Elder Lambert 17 did we understand our error and the circumstances that led to it. Even so, the document we were sent served our purpose best, as Christopher Tolkien had already provided etymological information from the Index of Names in the History of Middle-earth.
Oops.
A master of understatement, Wayne.
So I'm afraid, when we talk about the unfinished index, it's not really the unfinished index.
Right.
It is an index, but
that's it was, we sort of went, oh dear.
That is great. Oops.
You'll find that I was reading it out from page 726. It's the first volume
of the Companion Guide.
Yeah.
And that's the first volume of the new 3-volume version, correct?
Yes.
Okay. That's right. Yeah. This is something that we feel, obliged to do, which is if we goof, we'll own up to it. We've had a number of people write to us, saying, "Oh, you goofed on this page," and we might look at it and say, "Well, no, we didn't."
Right.
But sometimes, oh, yeah, we did.
Yeah.
And of course, there's the occasional typo, but given a work of that length, I think that's
of course,
that
is
under par, in fact.
I'm quite. Right.
Yeah.
And Tolkien fans are very good about pointing out those little goofs when we make them.
They are. We've learned that the hard way, haven't we, Sean?
We've made a number of goofs, and and our listeners are quick to point them out. And we usually did actually goof. There aren't many times when we can say no, we didn't make a mistake.
That's true.
May I tell you one goof?
You certainly made.
Absolutely.
Yeah, please.
Okay. That's it. Right at the beginning, and you were talking about our 9 Mythopoeic
Oh
awards.
no!
Oh my goodness!
Yeah, I've had 5. Christina's had 4 jointly with me, but it's not 9 total.
Oh my goodness!
Oh goodness! Okay. Between you,
we've got 5 lions, so that's still quite a few.
There you go. Oh my! Well, this may be a record for the quickest correction published, right, Sean?
Yes, actually being corrected in the same episode.
Usually when we make an error, we find out about it after it releases, not during the recording. This is brilliant. I love it.
Well, yes. There you go.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much. I love that.
But any errors in the companion and guide, though, it really are on us. Because it's not just that we wrote it, but I also typeset the whole thing. So,
oh goodness, you can't even blame the typographer for a
typographical
error.
No. Something there's a typo. It's
on you.
It's probably me.
Yeah.
Well, like you said, with a work of that size, with those 3 volumes, there's going to be a few errors. I'm sure,
of course. And as you said earlier, Wayne, just the fact that now you can post addenda and core agenda on the web, as I know you do on your site.
Yeah.
What a great thing that is. It's easy for us as scholars ourselves or readers to go.
Please tell me you put air quotes around scholars.
Scholars, us collectively as scholars.
Okay.
The ones who listen to us who happen to be scholars. Or as readers, to go out there and find out, hey, has there been an update to this since it was published? So
yeah.
I'm afraid we're very much behind because we have been busy and, Maker of Middle-earth added so much new stuff that we are still only partially absorbed it. You think of all those little letters, one-line quotes from letters, which add to the chronology or add a bit of information.
Yeah.
It's a long page.
Right.
I don't doubt that at all. Well, I guess that means probably a good time to move on to the companion and guide, right,
Yeah,
Sean?
I was just going to say, let's go ahead and spend a little more time talking about the J.R.R. Tolkien Companion and Guide. Another wonderful reference, and
Uh-huh.
As we've been discussing, a considerable undertaking for you, I know.
Vast, yes.
At the risk of repeating myself, thank you for doing it for us. And for listeners who aren't familiar with it, the Companion and Guide consists of two main parts. There's a chronology of Tolkien's life and works, and it's what's now a 2-volume alphabetical reader's guide. And to paraphrase your own words to explain what this is, it's not an alphabetical encyclopedia of Middle-earth along the lines of what you might get with something like Foster's Complete Guide to Middle-earth or Tyler's Complete Tolkien Companion. But it's, and now I'm going to quote you, it's a what's what, a where's where, and a who's who of Tolkien. And if I may add, maybe more on the man himself. Originally published in 2 volumes in 2006,
Yep.
It was just revised and expanded in 2017 to a 3-volume edition, with the Reader's Guide now expanded to 2 books. What prompted the new edition in 2017? And this could be a very long answer, but in a nutshell, what's new in the new edition?
Well, to back up, I mean, Christina was talking earlier about HarperCollins asking us to do this thing in the first place,
Right.
because Walter Hooper had done the C.S. Lewis Companion and Guide,
Mhm.
and originally we were looking at a single volume because Hooper's book is a single volume, but Hooper had included a sort of truncated biography of Lewis, and more legitimately so because he and
Roger
Lansing Green
yeah.
had already done a formal biography. We thought, well, if we did a biography of Tolkien like that, it would really just be sort of potting Carpenter. So we decided, well, let's do a chronology, and then we could just bring in the relevant facts and not have to worry about interpreting things
Right.
too much. And we started gathering the facts, and it grew and it grew. And we spent a lot of time in libraries and archives and looked at every scrap of manuscript that we could get our hands on,
Yeah.
every letter that we could find. And eventually we had so much chronology material that we said something to HarperCollins, and they said, well, let's make that 2 volumes then,
Mm-hmm.
which was very good of them.
Yes.
And then that came out in a nice package.
Yeah.
And we thought, well, that will be that, because it sold. But I think our books tend to sell steadily,
Right.
if not spectacularly, which is good.
Mm-hmm.
It's the kind of books we like to write,
Right.
Sure.
because they're the ones that are the most valuable. But we were over in London. Was it
Spring 2016?
Spring of 2016, and we visited HarperCollins, and much to our surprise, they said, well, we've sold out of the Companion and Guide.
Wow.
We thought, well, okay, that's that then. Well, we'd like a new edition.
Not a new printing, an entirely new edition. Okay.
Right.
Right. They thought, well, they didn't want to just correct a printing, because we'd had a lot of addenda
Sure. Right.
Sure.
online by that time, and they said, well, how much more do you think you would do? And I think we must have estimated something like at least 100 pages.
Well, we knew also that the first 2 volumes, they were the absolute extent. We couldn't have added a page more. They were at the...
That is true.
Yeah.
We had an absolute page count on
Right.
this,
Okay.
and one was certainly at the limit. So yeah, it had to go to 3 volumes, and then the question was, well, how do you make them
Right.
more or less, equal, if for the sake of things?
Right.
Are they going to be published separately? Are they going to be published only in a box set?
Right.
All of these things are questions you have to know. But of course, as we were working on that, more and more information came out. We thought of various articles that we hadn't put in the first edition that we thought really needed to go in.
Things that you maybe had to cut because of that hard page limit, right?
Yes, but
we didn't cut a great deal.
Okay.
When we did the first one, we had a lot of tricks. I mean, we cut out a lot of cross references and so forth.
Okay.
We didn't leave out too much.
But, so much came out since then, starting with The Children of Hurin.
Oh, yes, that's true.
And that was a problem to us, because actually in the Lays of Beleriand, Christopher says the title of the poem was The Children of Hurin, and we decided to use that in the first edition instead of the Lay of the Children of Hurin. And then just after it came out, Christopher
publishes The Children of Hurin, which is not the same thing as the
Right.
Lay. It's the published book of that. But we had things like, we had not included an article on Richard Wagner. We had not included one on Kenneth Grahame, I think, right?
You might have added Kenneth Grahame, but certainly I added Lewis Carroll and Peter
Jane Barry.
James Barry,
Francis Thompson. I did a couple of things on the
Collingwood.
Tolkien's method of writing and Tolkien in his own works.
And we had to add to the article on adaptations because
of course,
the films, and all sorts of things that suddenly come up.
Yeah.
And we had the room to do it because we could have 3 volumes. But of course, then when you've done this one we had to do a new index because it's all totally changed.
True. Right, of course.
And also this time we were unable to do it the first time around because Christina had some medical issues and the thing had to go to press. But this time we actually were able to add running heads so that you could find your way around in it.
Yeah.
It was terrible even for ourselves trying to find our way around. But it is something that we can do, of course, since doing the typesetting.
Yeah.
But we did add a substantial amount. There is a list on our website of the editions.
Oh, okay.
So that it is, it's not just a little bit added to it. And,
no.
Well, now we divided it into 3 volumes. There's a substantial amount more, so that
there really is, yeah.
It's well over 1 million words now.
Okay.
Oh my goodness. Wow. I had the 2-volume edition, of course, and
I
ordered the 3-volume edition.
It was quite a bit.
This is quite beefier, yeah. And it's funny, I had not consciously noted the running heads, but when you mentioned it, I was like, oh, yeah, absolutely right, because I did find myself, it was much easier to navigate than the second version. So, yeah.
And I was glad to see it come out because it took me forever to track down a nice copy of the 2-volume edition. And when I got it, it was unfortunately damaged. And so I was really happy to have a nice new edition when the 3-volume came out. That's in pristine condition.
Absolutely.
And HarperCollins really has done a good job of printing with this.
Yes.
So it's a handsome book and it's very readable. Surprisingly, although it took a few years for the first edition to sell out, this one they had to go back to press.
Oh wow!
Very quickly.
That's excellent news
for second printing.
Good.
So, yeah, it was
a good problem to have.
Yeah.
I think this is the internet culture because you think of all those people on the Tolkien Society's Facebook page,
right?
And people put it up. It does spread the news.
Yeah, it does.
It's good publicity.
Yeah, I know we saw it a number of times. People were very excited about the 3-volume edition. I know we mentioned it on the show, I believe, and of course we've had links to it on our library page as well. So, in the preface of the companion and guide, speaking of the chronology, you observe that the little details of Tolkien's life, and I love this quote, form a picture of an extraordinarily busy man. Tolkien the scholar, Tolkien the teacher and administrator, Tolkien the husband and father, Tolkien the creator of Middle-earth. Now, you say that one of your goals in the book was to show that Tolkien neither wasted his time nor shirked his responsibilities. Now, that's especially to those who are pretty familiar with that stereotypical picture of Tolkien as a man who niggled endlessly over details and therefore left an incredible amount of work unfinished at the time of his death. Now, when you read the chronology, you realize just how busy his position at Oxford kept him, along with a reasonably active social life, really. In a way, it seems we should consider ourselves fortunate that he finished and published the few things that he did. I wondered if you could, it's kind of an open-ended thing, but I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about that, giving our listeners a feel for how Tolkien's writing, how his sub-creation fit into the workings of his day-to-day life as a professor and as a husband and father.
Well, for one thing, a great deal of his writing took place in the vacations, especially the long vac. And very often late at night, as he says. He seems not to have needed a lot of sleep.
And he didn't have to be distracted by the internet or Facebook.
Right.
That's true.
So television.
Yeah.
But I think people didn't realize, when you look at it, at one point, for instance, he was supervising 9 postgraduate students, which meant usually seeing them each for an hour or so once a week.
Right.
On top of committee meetings. He was always on the English faculty board.
Yeah.
As a professor, he was always on the faculty board. Other readers or lecturers were only on for a short time, but he was always on the board.
Yeah.
As a full professor.
Right.
We had the question early on in writing the companion and guide, do you really need to include all of those meetings and all of those things regarding Oxford? And our reply was, this was his life.
Yeah.
This was what he did day to day. And you need to know that, to certainly defend Tolkien against the charges that he was just
shirked his job. And
it was just out in Middle Earth and writing his fantasy fiction. And that's why he didn't get things done. He had a lot of administrative duties, and this was the way it was at Oxford, without the help that professors will often have now, in terms of administrative assistants or secretaries in the department or so forth. Tolkien didn't have that. He gave more lectures than he was required to do. He was on all of these committees. This is what paid the bills.
True.
It was also his primary life. We tend to think of him, and things like the edition of the published letters tends to concentrate on his fiction writing.
Sure.
But he was, he did not shirk his duties by any means.
No.
I think somewhere we say it was not that he sort of failed to do, he just tried to do too much.
Yes.
Yeah. There's only 24 hours in a day, and you have to sleep at some point, even if you don't need as much as everyone else.
He was also a dedicated teacher. This is what he enjoyed doing. And if you look at some of the other people, some people who were his colleagues, people like George Gordon, or some of the younger faculty, they didn't necessarily publish a lot in their field, but they taught. And in academia, even now, in any country, the argument goes on, how much should you be concentrating on your research? In a big university, well, there are faculty who are basically there for the research, and they may teach a class or two. Places like Williams, teaching is the main thing.
Right.
Although you're expected to do your other work as well.
Right.
I'm a librarian, so I don't really have those things, although I teach, but all of this that we're talking about is on my own time.
Right.
Well, and that's the wonderful thing about just opening the chronology and just flipping through the pages. I really enjoy doing it because you do see how much time he spent teaching and on his administrative duties. And it's fascinating to see how much, as you said, how much time he spent on that as opposed to, the fiction writing that we remember him for. And that's ultimately the reason we're here today. But he did have this whole other day job, really.
Well, and we had to have that because, as Christina was saying, when did he do his writing? He did it when he was not teaching, when he didn't have, by and large, the academic duties to perform. You have to have the one to understand the other.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah. To get a full-orbed vision of who he was, you definitely need to have that material and know just how much of his life, he had to spend doing those things and how that shaped who he was.
And what he wrote,
I'm jealous thinking about those students that got to sit under his tutelage. What a privilege, because he did pour himself into his teaching. He did care about teaching those kids.
There are a lot of acknowledgements from people, and quite a lot. There's the occasional thing where people say of a student's work, well, you can see Tolkien's influence in this.
I bet, yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing is, but then even when it came to his publishing, Jane Neave suggested an edition of some of the poems just for the poem of Tom Bombadil. But Rayner wanted a few more, and Tolkien went round and rewrote most of the stuff.
Yeah.
So he didn't shirk that either.
No. We just finished our chapters on Tom Bombadil in our recordings, and we remember looking at the different versions that from the original The Adventures of Tom Bombadil to the published version in The Lord of the Rings and the changes. And you're right. I mean, all of that thanks to Aunt Jane and to Rayner and to how they, wanted to see Tom in there. More of Tom.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about some of your books on Tolkien's art, and we've already hit on the sort of the inception of J.R.R. Tolkien, artist and illustrator. I want to kind of go back to that. You've already told us about how that came to be and how Christopher Tolkien asked you to put that together. But before that work, I believe the most comprehensive study of Tolkien's art that was available was Pictures by J.R.R. Tolkien, which was 1979, if I'm not mistaken. But With Artist and Illustrator, the two of you went much deeper into Tolkien's early art and alternate versions and preliminary versions of works that came out later. Talk us through a little bit of that and why that approach sort of appealed to you. It almost seems to me as, I don't want to put words in your mouth or anything, but it almost seems to me as sort of the history of Middle-earth version of Tolkien as an artist, showing these different versions. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on that approach.
I think one should start actually with pictures, which really was based, well, for a long time, Rayner and others wanted to add extra to Tolkien, and they had the calendars. People wanted calendars. There had been a lot of calendars with art on Tolkien, but not by Tolkien.
Right.
We're thinking of the Hildebrands and Sweet and a few others. And then they started putting out ones with art, with Tolkien's own art, but they tended to be blown right up. The pictures, bigger than they were. And if you see the originals now, you'll realize that they were bigger, but also not all that well reproduced. But they wanted to do a book on Tolkien's art. And I think Christopher, they didn't even re-originate the art for the pictures. They just used it from the calendars. And obviously, it was a stopgap. I think Christopher himself felt that it was a stopgap to what was done.
It was.
Okay.
Yeah, he certainly felt that. I think that was told to us, but it was the best they could do at the time. I think it was the calendars with Tolkien's own art came out, and then the
yes, they were 73, 74.
Yeah, then you had Tim Kirk, and you had the Hildebrands much later.
Right.
But the pictures was just a collection of the calendar art. And when we started looking at the art, we were astonished to find how small many of the pictures actually were in the original. So when we did Artist and Illustrator, we made the case that you really shouldn't blow them up because it doesn't do them any good. But, not necessarily actual size. Sometimes the things had to be shrunk. But it was a discovery that we had to make. And we didn't want to do another pictures, and they didn't want to have another pictures. They wanted to have something that was really about Tolkien as an artist. That he was an artist. He wasn't just somebody playing around.
No.
And the Tolkien estate, Christopher Tolkien wanted this aspect of his father's life to be brought out as much as being a writer was brought out. But having done Artist and Illustrator, we knew that there were more things. There were, of course, many pictures that we couldn't put in the book because of space. And then, it was great to have the opportunity to do the other two art books, The Art of the Hobbit, Art of the Lord of the Rings, because we could bring in everything that at least that we knew about.
We didn't ask for those. We were just asked to do them. They sort of arrived by email.
Okay.
Yes.
Are you interested in?
Yes, please.
The answer is always
Absolutely,
yes,
sure.
right? I mean, if the estate or HarperCollins reaches out to you, you say yes.
I've always thought that some of Tolkien's art is very fine, and I think the recent Bodley and Morgan exhibitions have really made people aware of him as an artist.
Yes.
We were aware of it. We did our best in Artist and Illustrator for this, but I think people have been really stunned. They didn't expect how he's... And when you saw how big they blew them up to sort of 6-7 foot tall, and how well they stood up to the...
The watercolors certainly are marvelous, and they do hold up very well. We were astonished ourselves when we came to do the Art of the Lord of the Rings. The Bodleian Library sent us electronic files of all of the pictures because, again, I was actually putting the thing together in the computer.
Right.
And, of course, those are great because they were new pictures. They were high definition.
Yeah.
And you could zoom in on them, and we could see things that you couldn't even... It's funny, you can't even see very well in the original, because I was looking at Bilbo Woke, the eagle picture for The Hobbit, and there was some writing at the bottom that Tolkien had sort of mostly painted over, and in the electronic image, you can zoom in on that, and I could see what it was. But just looking at it at the Morgan, it's really hard to see.
Yeah.
But what really surprised us when we came to do the Art of the Lord of the Rings and got the electronic files for that was all of the maps that we'd never seen before, that we never even knew existed.
That's actually my very next question, so I'm going to actually cut you off and start another question because the maps deserve their own.
Well, great minds.
Yeah. Well, since then, since artist and illustrator, you've continued to shed light on Tolkien's work as a visual artist with the art books that you just talked about, The Art of the Hobbit and The Art of the Lord of the Rings. In the introduction to the latter of those two, which was just published in 2015, you say, "It is only right to consider Tolkien's cartography as art, no less than the other products of his pen or brush." We recently talked about the maps on an episode. I think we were talking about examples of cartography that I saw at the Bodleian Library last year. And we, of course, acknowledge that it's primarily Christopher's maps that readers are familiar with from the published books. Mm-hmm. Can you shed a little more light on Tolkien's cartography skills for our listeners and let them know where they might find some of his work instead of the more familiar maps that we know from Christopher and others, like Karen von Stad's Atlas, for example?
Of course, the Hobbit maps are his.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And the Silmarillion, the History of Middle-earth does have some original of the Silmarillion.
Yes.
I didn't realize that. I thought
some...
I thought the Silmarillion was Christopher's. That's good to know.
No, there's one there that is his father. There was a Silmarillion map at the exhibitions, and
there's several. There's several. I mean, the Ambarkanta map and so forth, and then there are a number that Christopher redrew for clarity.
Right.
But in terms of the Lord of the Rings, I mean, there's that often quoted phrase from Tolkien wherever he did, that I started with a map.
Right.
You have to start with a map, otherwise you can't go back and make a map.
It was from the letter to Rona Bear, I believe, if I'm not mistaken.
Maybe. It's not entirely true.
Of course.
He didn't start with a map. He started writing. Of course, he started coming out of The Hobbit and doing the sequel to that.
Well, The Hobbit did start with a map in a way because there's Thror's map.
Right.
Yes. I mean,
and it was on the...
Right. But he was talking about the Lord of the Rings. And I think the best that can be said is that he made a map early.
Yeah.
And wisely. And that's the one that has got things pasted onto it and sort of goes out it grew organically. It goes out in every direction. Mm-hmm. I think he must have had map making skills that he learned from being in the Army in World War I.
Okay. Yeah.
Signaling officer. I don't think we've read anything about that, but I think that must have happened.
You're right. There must be formal training.
There is a map which the catalogue, the Judith Priestman catalogue, thought was by Tolkien, but I think people are sure that it's not by him. It was one that he happened to have because it was of the.
It's a trench map, and those were produced very very quickly.
Okay.
He must have. He presumably.
Yeah, as a communications officer. Yeah, signals officer. That makes sense. Because you look at those maps and you see evidence of formal training with the contour lines and the grid markers. And I mean, it's breathtaking in its accuracy and detail. Mm. And it's just something that I don't think our average reader, the ones who maybe have not seen the exhibits at the Bodleian and the Morgan, would necessarily have an understanding of. And I thought, I was hoping that you could shed a little light on it. You already have, but you please do more.
He certainly had looked at maps and he understood the conventions of map making. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting, of course, is that he was making a map of a place that doesn't really exist.
Yeah.
So it was all out of his imagination, and he would set things down and he would revise it as the story developed. And then you had successive maps. And, of course, you had the maps of the smaller areas, like the Shire and the surrounding territories, that he would do. And, of course, in our book, we publish all of them that we know about, or that have survived anyway. And you can see how those develop. And sometimes the story is different in the map, and sometimes it's the same. Mm-hmm. But it was something that we wanted to do in Artist and Illustrator, but we ran out of space.
Yeah.
And something had to give. So that we're very happy to be able to deal with the maps in Art of the Lord of the Rings.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you did too.
Is, he does say somewhere that he never made people travel further in a day than it would have been physically possible.
Right.
And there's all that thing with the Hobbit strides and the Drent strides and the rest of it, that he certainly would have known from marching how far the army could go in a day. Mm-hmm. And it's in one of the letters.
Yeah.
And this would have been something that would have affected his maps. He would always be looking, could they have got that far?
Right. Whether it was on foot or whether it's on horseback, whether it's a large group of people, small group of people.
Yes. Right.
Yeah. Somebody's injured, like after Weathertop, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Correct. This is something that isn't always appreciated with Tolkien's writing, is that although he was writing fantasy fiction, he was writing about a world as if it could exist.
Right.
So everything had to be grounded in
Right.
reality.
Mm-hmm.
Something that when you get the film adaptations, for example, and time gets compressed, my goodness, that was not any distance at all between Isengard and Minas Tirith.
Yeah.
Right.
We're just going to take a little jaunt from. We'll be there in an hour or
It's
two.
just around the corner.
Right.
Yes.
Or Gandalf going all the way to Minas Tirith for research and seemingly coming back the next day instead of,
Sure does
17
seem
years
like
later.
yes.
right away.
Yes.
You caught the Intercity Express,
Exactly.
and there you go.
Just hop on the interstate.
Right.
You're there in no time.
Right.
Man. It's just an hour's drive.
Well, I'd like to ask one more question about the exhibitions, because I did not make it to the Bodleian and I have not made it to the Morgan, but I do have the catalog and I've perused that pretty closely. And I want to ask you a little bit about one of Tolkien's own comments about his artistic ability that comes up in letter number 13 to C.A. Firth. This is where he called some of his own illustrations for The Hobbit amateurish. And it's very striking to me that, Tolkien had this opinion of his own artistic ability. As we've been talking about, he was an artist. He was not just many people of his time, as I think you say in your essay in that catalog, that many turn of the 20th century English men and women, took up drawing casually, but Tolkien was one of the rare few who was really good at it.
He was not good at figures.
Yeah.
That's true. No, you're right.
I think he realized that he was not good at figures.
Yeah.
He could actually sometimes be the ones he uses in other Christmas letters are stylized.
Right.
They're for children almost.
Yeah.
And they work.
They do.
And he's much better at landscapes.
Yeah. It's true.
And you can even see that in how he scales the landscape and the figures. I'm thinking
the
of
Mirkwood picture, or the Tower
the one that's Tower Nafuin and Mirkwood, the one that kind of serves dual purpose, and you can barely spot the elves in that image because they're so tiny compared to the rest of the drawing. Right. And you're right. It's even Bilbo comes to the huts of the Raft Elves. There's tiny Bilbo on a barrel. And
that landscape is
this
beautiful.
massive landscape.
And
it's gorgeous. The most iconic images we've seen.
I wonder, is that why he didn't think much of himself as an artist, because he wasn't very good at figures?
Well, that may have entered into it. We don't have any direct quote on that. He was certainly better than he let on. Mm-hmm. He was modest in terms of his art. And in other things as well. But I think the real issue was that he was always drawing for himself or for his children. He was always working for a sympathetic sort of at-home audience. And then all of a sudden, The Hobbit is going to be published. It's going to be out there. Now, Tolkien is just as good an artist as Hugh Lofting for Dr. Dolittle or Arthur Ransom for Swallows and Amazons. And in some ways better, certainly. I mean, they neither of them did watercolor pictures the way he did. But it was a matter of coming out into the public eye and thinking he, just not good enough. And, you had the same thing when it came to The Lord of the Rings, and he felt that his elvish lettering that was going to be reproduced, like for the ring inscription, was just not delicate enough. It wasn't really elvish enough. But after The Hobbit, during his lifetime, you don't see any illustrations by him.
It's true.
He didn't do any for Farmer Jaws of Ham. Pauline Baynes did those. And, at one point was hoping that she could do something for The Lord of the Rings that was then being written. And, of course, she did Smith and Wooden Major and Adventures of Tom Bombadil. But Tolkien was not really as confident as he might have been as an artist in the public eye.
I've always thought it interesting that he did keep all the Father Christmas letters.
Yes.
He took them back from the children, and they just evidently discovered them after his death in an envelope. And he obviously felt they were worth keeping.
Yeah.
Or at any rate, perhaps it was the memory of doing it for the children. He did do a few for the Lord of the Rings, but it was mainly trying to work out what the place looked like. And I can imagine that if you read his description of Lothlorien, and lovely as his drawing is, and it really does look beautiful, nonetheless, it's not quite what he managed to do with words.
That may be true. Yeah, you're right.
I think that now, as Christina said, the response to the exhibitions has been, and you get this in a lot of the reviews that have come out. They speak about the art, especially. Of course, in an exhibition, the visual is always going to
Sure.
be paramount. But people have been genuinely surprised to see these things, and of course, see them in the original is just wonderful. We do our best. The printers do their best in our books, but there's no substitute for looking at the original.
That is true.
And then buying our books.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. We have recommended those art books repeatedly, and we'll continue to do so. They're phenomenal. But yeah, seeing them in person, I ended up at the exhibit 3 different times during the 5 days that I was in England. I just couldn't help it. It was a fantastic exhibit, and being able to just stand there for 10, 15 minutes looking at all the details of one particular piece, preferably the maps. That's what I tended to focus on, but they were amazing. And it does seem like we're seeing some of his usual, like you mentioned, his modesty, his sort of self-deprecation. And it's encouraging to see that people are now noticing what an amazing
and appreciating
artist
that.
he really was.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree. Well, I know we're nearing the end of our time, so we're gonna probably just get a couple more quick questions in. In fact, we're gonna save a couple of these questions for when we see you in Birmingham later this year. So we'll just go with this one first. We want to talk a little bit about your award-winning blog, Too Many Books and Never Enough. That's at wayneandchristina.wordpress.com. We'll put a link in our show notes and in our social media links on this episode. That blog received the 2018 Tolkien Society Award for Best Website. Now, we recently sent listeners there for your addenda and core agenda to The Adventures of Tom Bombadil and that eye-opening letter by Tolkien to Neville Coghill in 1954. But there is so much there on Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and other authors, book collecting, art, just everything. So listeners, please check that out. But I want to ask specifically about a blog post from September 2nd last year, reflecting on the 45th anniversary of Tolkien's death. You wrote, "We had no idea then that so many unpublished works by Tolkien would be brought out over so many years, let alone that we, who had not yet met, would have a hand in the process." It must be beyond the wildest expectations that you could have had before to know that you have had a hand in the process. Can you share with our listeners a bit of the emotions, about your feelings about having been such an important part of bringing Tolkien's unpublished works to light for so many fans and readers?
It's we sometimes will look at books we published sitting on the shelf, and it's very much as if someone else had done that. It's exhausting to think about it, the amount of work that's gone into it. But we do also think back to when we were just fans, and how one thing has led to another. Of course, being fans led to our meeting and getting married. But yes, to have had the opportunity and the privilege to do this kind of work, to do the research, to be involved with the Tolkien family, the estate, to be able to enter into these great collections, and then to bring out things that seem to have some lasting value. I think it's a very gratifying achievement.
I'll take you back a little further to 1987 and Marquette. It was MythCon, and it was the 50th anniversary of the publication of The Hobbit, and Christopher was there, and he, of course, and so was Tom Santosky, who was alive, and John Ratcliffe and Douglas Anderson, all of whom had been in touch with Christopher. And during their discussions with Christopher at the time, and we learned afterwards that Tom was going to be editing The Hobbit and that Doug was going to be doing an annotated Hobbit.
Right.
And we looked at each other and said, wouldn't it be lovely if it was us?
Little did you know.
Well, it wasn't those, but...
No.
John Ratcliffe, of course, got The Hobbit when Tom died.
Right, the history of The Hobbit.
Yeah.
But we were left outside, but we weren't.
Yeah, only for a short time. That's right.
Wonderful.
I'm looking at our blog on a tablet, and we haven't put up a post since last September.
I think that's quite likely. We've been. I
know, but I thought it was only since maybe at the end of last year.
Right.
Well, you've had a few things going on.
We've had a few things going on.
Now you can say we were recently on the Prancing Pony podcast. You got something to blog about.
I mean, we haven't written anything about, we give our talk on Tolkien as an artist at the Morgan Library at the end of January. And then a week later was the private opening of the exhibition with a dinner. Mm-hmm. And that was nice, seeing so many people there. And
I'm sure.
Simon Tolkien was there.
Okay.
Simon was a guest on our show.
And I sat next to Catherine in the dinner.
Yeah.
Very nice.
Catherine McElwain. Very, very nice. But we haven't written about that. And there's all sorts of things that we should get to.
Well,
we're not as bad as some people with blogs.
There you go.
I'll say that.
But we've also been having work done on the house, which has meant moving books.
Oh, right.
Oh goodness, yes.
We had my home office painted finally after so many years, and I don't know how many hundreds of books we just had to move out of that room.
Goodness,
so,
that must have been a project.
Going back in.
Yeah.
That was not fun.
And for a librarian, they have to be put back exactly in the right positions, don't they? They have to be right where they need to be.
Well, I'm doing some reshelving and rethinking about things. The whole thing with too many books and never enough. This was something that came out of when Christina was still living in London and had like 6,000 books in her little flat in Battersea. And some of them were on the floor. And I was walking across the room and I almost tripped over some. And I said, too many books. And she said, never enough.
That's brilliant.
That's wonderful.
So she moved here. I had my books. She had her books. We weeded duplicates and have proceeded to add a lot more. So shelf space is always an issue. So we're continually rethinking how things are going to be organized.
And we had a bookcase.
Right.
And we had a bookcase.
If you ever need
to
start clearing books out and you're looking to sell them, just reach out to
us.
us. Let us know.
We had a major sale actually.
How did I miss
after
that?
we got married and Christina moved over, and there was some bargains in that one. But we did keep a lot of duplicates as working copies.
Of course, yeah.
And if you're a collector, you know that there sometimes are not really duplicates, that there are small changes that have been made.
Yeah.
But it's not just Tolkien that we have.
Well, no.
We really ought to write more about books in general on a blog that's called Too Many Books and Never Enough.
Well, that's what I love about your blog is the little bits that you have here and there on C.S. Lewis or Kenneth Grahame or other authors that we might be interested in. So,
right.
Well, I know that we're going to be seeing you both very soon in Birmingham at Tolkien 2019. So we'll leave a couple of questions for when we see you there. But before we go, I'd like to give you an opportunity to share with us. Is there anything else that you're working on that you'd like to talk about? What's next for Wayne Hammond and Christina Scull?
Well, putting the books back in order is the main thing right now.
Fair enough.
And of course, I administer a Rare Books library, so there's that. Of course, the last thing we did was to prepare the presentation, Tolkien as an artist, for the Morgan. Mm-hmm. And just before that, we had the essay on Tolkien's art for the Maker of Middle-earth. We've been picking away for quite a while on biography of sorts on Pauline Baynes, on all of her work. We have a major Pauline Baynes collection. And the Baynes archive, in fact, is at Chapin Library here at Williams. But we don't have any actual contracts for anything right now. But something else is obviously going to come up.
Good.
It always does.
Well, and I'm sure you're well suited to take it on. So we're looking forward to that, whenever it may be.
Are.
In the meantime, thank you for joining us, Wayne and Christina. It has been a genuine treat to have you on the show. We really appreciate the time you've given to us and to our listeners. We would be happy, of course, to have you back on the show at any time. So please consider this a standing invitation.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you both so much. And listeners, that is going to wrap it up for another episode and for Season 3 of the Prancing Pony Podcast.
That's right, folks. This is our last episode before we take a brief summer hiatus. We'll be back in early September with episode 136, coming to you from Tolkien 2019 in Birmingham. And as we mentioned earlier, Wayne and Christina will be joining us then as well, albeit for a much shorter segment.
Now, while we are off, we are still going to be around on social media. Barliman will still be bringing us the mail, and most importantly, we will still be working on getting ready for Season 4 and Book 2 of The Lord of the Rings.
That's right. Now, even Sean and I need a small break once in a while, even if it's mostly from each other.
Yeah, there is that.
Yeah. So listeners, if you have any questions, just let us know on social media. We'll still be around, or by emailing barliman@theprancingponypodcast.com.
Now, as always, we want to remind you about the Fellowship of the Podcast. That's our family of supporters at Patreon. If you'd like to see how we're doing towards our Patreon goals, you can see those at patreon.com/prancingponypod. And if you're looking for a new Tolkien book, check out the official library pages at our website, theprancingponypodcast.com, where we've put together a set of links for our listeners to all the books we've ever mentioned on the show, Tolkien
And this
or
is probably
otherwise.
where I should recommend.
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
And I should probably recommend at this point any of the works by our current guests
That's
today. We shall have many
Yep.
of those links up for you.
Yep, exactly where I was going with that, Alan. You read my mind.
Yep.
And folks, if you wouldn't mind posting a review for us on iTunes, we'd be grateful. That increases our visibility, which means more new listeners, more great questions for Barliman, more discussion on social media, and a more vibrant Tolkien community.
And speaking of social media, it's also helpful if you share us. Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, wherever there are Tolkien fans, please let them know about us. Well, folks, that wraps it up for another episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast.
Thanks again for listening, and thank you for making our common room on Facebook such a fun place to spend time. We want all of you to be a part of this conversation, and it does not stop when the episode ends. You can see the comments, questions, corrections, and more on Facebook at the Prancing Pony Podcast, on Twitter at Prancing Pony Pod, and on Instagram at Prancing Pony Pod.
And a very special thank you to our patrons at the Kierdan's contribution tier: DeMay in Alaska, James in Virginia, Tamsin in Minnesota, Emily in Texas, and Chad in Texas. Thanks again.
Make sure you don't miss any episodes of the Prancing Pony Podcast by subscribing to the show through iTunes, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app.
One last thing as always, don't forget to send your thoughts, comments, and most of all, what you're doing over the Prancing Pony Podcast summer hiatus to barliman@theprancingponypodcast.com, and we'll try to get them into our next episode. Well, however long we've had, it's still far too short a time to spend among such excellent and admirable listeners. But until next time.
Farewell, friends.